There are beloved, well-known fairy tales, and then there's Cinderella, one of the most famous fairy tales of them all. The neglected and abused orphan rallies from her bad lot in life and even gets to marry a prince. Happy days ahead, we hope. But Bev and I can tell you as well as anyone can what isn't a fairy tale as it relates to this podcast. And that's our sponsor, Sparkplug Coffee. What a transition. No, Sparkplug is grounded in mega reality by offering you the best quality, premium coffee beans you'll ever brew with. This stuff is affordable, much more so than takeout, and it's convenient. They deliver right to your door. And if you're a Canadian, you get free shipping. Sparkplug hopes you'll find your new favorite, but the chances you'll do that will be greater if you keep ordering. And if you intend to do that, you should join the Autopilot Coffee Club. Pause or cancel any old time, especially if your stepmother and stepsisters keep you so busy that you just don't have time to do any brewing for a while. No brewing, not even the mice. Nobody's going to be brewing. The website is sparkplug.coffee/HYES. That HYES part represents our discount code, so plug that into the box and get a one-time 20% savings. Go to sparkplug.coffee and give it a try. You'll drink happily ever after. Okay, fans of the bibbidi, the bobbidi, and the boo, the nice girl up in the attic is waiting on us. Bev asked Andrew to play our theme song.
And action! Have you ever seen
Cinderella? Hi there, movie monkeys, and thanks for dropping by to hear the 645th show on this Classic Movies podcasting channel. Heads up, we'll be spoiling this fairy tale today. This is Old Love Month, by the way, on Have You Ever Seen, where we're looking back at romantic movies that were released a very long time ago. So, Old Love. I'm your host, who's not a prince, although I'm occasionally charming. Just occasionally, sometimes, not often. Ryan Ellis. And here's the lady who digs on mice and wears uncomfortable shoes sometimes. My wife, Bev.
That's me.
I say I'm no prince, but my name does translate to Little King, or Prince.
Is that right?
In, I think it was grade school, elementary school, we had computer class, and my password was Prince. And I chose it because I must have found out. I know I found out. That was what my name meant. Or Little King. All right, the coming attractions trivia question. Look at all this knowledge I'm dropping on you. For Cinderella. Now that we are reviewing Cinderella, we've covered all 10 of the AFI's choices in their animation category on the top 100 genres list. 10 movies, 10 genres, 100 movies. I can do math. Not surprisingly, that 10-some is mostly Disney movies, 2 of which were made by Pixar, but Disney does own Pixar now. Toy Story and Finding Nemo, they're the 2. So what's the only one on that list that wasn't released by Mickey Mouse and Friends?
I think most people would probably get this on their first guess. It was my first guess, and that's Shrek.
Shrek. It was number 8, one spot ahead of Cinderella.
It's not surprising that Disney is so dominant, but it is kind of wild that Disney is so dominant. And Pixar.
If it wasn't the American Film Institute, if it was worldwide, Miyazaki would have at least a couple.
Yeah, absolutely.
And other places probably would too. The French have made pretty good animated movies over the years. Anyway, yes, almost entirely Disney except for The Ogre. Okay, The Girl with the Impractical Footwear was released by Walt Disney Pictures and RKO in early February 1950. Then it was released wider in early March that year, so this thing is right around 75 years old. I again can do math. And Holy Pumpkins, was it ever a hit? Disney had many ups and downs the years that followed Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was 13 years earlier, and they'd been in quite a down period in the late 40s, partly because of the war. But this was their biggest hit since, I think, Snow White, 13 years earlier. But Bev, the movie is 75 years old, so we need a refresher. Well, actually, do we? It's Cinderella. It's a pretty famous story. Well, anyway, this is what we do at this stage of the podcast, so please give us the skinny on Cinderella.
All right, for those who don't know, Cinderella is a teenage orphan forced into servitude in the home of her stepfamily after her father's death.
It is her house, too.
It's her house. Cinderella is trapped, but she remains sweet and optimistic and finds friendship with the birds and mice that live in her home. When her evil stepmother and stepsister stop Cinderella from attending a royal ball, the distraught girl meets her fairy godmother, who uses magic to transform Cinderella's sad circumstances into a beautiful night. At the ball, Cinderella meets and falls in love with the prince, but leaves behind just a single glass slipper for him to identify her by. So he does what any lovesick suitor would do. He sends his father's footman door to door to examine the feet of every maiden in the kingdom. Because God knows he wouldn't recognize her. Yeah. Cinderella is identified. She marries the prince, and they live happily ever after.
We haven't done reasonably good questions in a while that I've had a section for, but we will today. And that's one of them, that he doesn't go along with the footman, the Duke, actually, to find out. Because he would know. He knows her face. It was only, well, maybe it's been a few days, but it hasn't been that long.
Doesn't really stand up to reason for all that long. Why it's an important element of the story, I don't know.
It'd be far more romantic if he was the one that would, well, she uses the slipper she kept. But anyway, if he put it on her foot rather than the footman. So in a nutshell, this really should be called Mice and the Cat. I think the animals get more screen time than the humans do. I was wondering why that bothered me because I love Snow White, one of my favorite, if not my very favorite, animated films. And guess what? Same thing. You've got a fairly boring main character. Cinderella might be a little bit better than Snow White. I like Snow White more, actually. I think she's just sweeter. Anyway, they're both good, but they're dull. Their side characters have the same basic responsibilities in the movie, which is to carry most of the story, but the dwarves are funnier. Maybe that's what it is. I don't think the mice and the cat are all... Well, the cat's not supposed to be that funny, but the mice aren't that funny.
Agree, the mice are annoying. One of the reviews I read called them the Ewoks of the Disney princess movies. There's something about them that's just trying too hard, I guess. And they take up so much screen time.
It's not a long movie. It's about an hour 15 or so.
As does, I would hazard a guess, the king might have more dialogue
more than
in
the
this
prince
film than Cinderella might.
Close.
It's got to be close. He just wants grandkids so bad. It's cute. It's funny.
Cute. It's
but
different.
It's amazing how much the movie strays away from its main storyline because I guess they had a 20-page storybook that they had to stretch to
a 30-minute movie, and they more than doubled that, but it is a pretty short film. Although it looked fantastic. One of the best-looking movies we've seen in quite a while in any service. Okay, there's a lot of numbers. Let's get through all that. So Rotten Tomatoes, 97% of critics like the film, 38 fresh, 1 rotten. The average is 8 out of 10. And 80% of audiences. Considering this was such a smash, I'm surprised it wasn't more than 80%, but 80 is good. Michael Curtiz, the Casablanca director, apparently loved it. Sent a note to Disney saying how good it was. Cinderella 2, what's it called? Dreams Come True in 2002, only gets 13%. But Cinderella 3, A Twist in Time, that was in 2007, both straight-to-video movies, by the way, straight-to-video sequels, is at 75%. And I've never seen either, I don't think. I meant to, but ran out of time.
Did you look up the live-action Cinderella?
I'm about to say that. Kenneth Branagh's 2015 live-action remake with Lily James as Cindy is at 84%. I didn't know it was so well liked. I thought it was okay. And it was a smash hit, too. It's one of the biggest hits of 2015. The Numbers ranks the 1950 Cinderella at number 1 that year. Father of the Bride was 3rd. We just covered that 2 weeks ago. And All About Eve, the Best Picture winner, one of the best movies of all time, was 4th at the box office that year. That's what the number says. 64th is what this is on Box Office Mojo's Top 200 adjusted for inflation. But like I said, when we covered Father of the Bride, that list isn't updated anymore. I don't know why they stopped updating Box Office Mojo in 2020, I guess, for some reason. But
purchased by some other larger company?
Well, something happened there where the IMDb has it now, and it's not as good a site as it was at all. Anyway, 64th as of a few years ago. It's probably still somewhere in the 70s at least, if not the 80s. And like all or most Disney classics, it was re-released a few times, so that's more money. It's a little bit skewed. Gone with the Wind is such a huge hit, partly because it came out many times over the years. It wasn't just 1939 and 1940 that made it such a big hit. Cinderella went into the National Film Registry in 2018, along with 9 others we've reviewed. 9 more. Broadcast News, Brokeback Mountain, Hood, Jurassic Park, My Fair Lady, The Navigator, On the Town, Pick Up on South Street, and The Shining. And a lot of those have been covered just recently, the last couple of years, mostly by me on this podcast. This was nominated for 3 Oscars for the sound, the music score, and Bibbidi-Bobbidi-Boo for Best Song. And it was 9th in the animation category, AFI's Top 100 Genres. We said that already, didn't we? And it was also nominated for the Top 100 Passions, the Top 25 Musicals, the Top 100 Songs for both Bibbidi-Bobbidi-Boo and the one that Cinderella sings, A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes. The Bibbidi-Bobbidi is the fairy godmother, of course. The Stepmother, Lady Tremaine, was up for the Top 50 Villains, and the film was a candidate for the 1998 and 2007 AFI Top 100s. But the only 3 animated movies that made those 2 lists combined, 123 movies, were, do you remember? We said one of them already.
Toy Story.
Well, 2 of them already, because...
Shrek?
Nope. Toy Story, yes. Snow White.
Snow White, of course. Fantasia, of course.
And Fantasia. Yeah. And only of those did Snow White make both. Toy Story was on the second list, and Fantasia was on the first, but not a crossover for those 2. I think you said either to me or on the podcast, which I guess is to me anyway, that you've seen this before, right? So you have. It was a long time ago, I guess. Cinderella, thoughts now?
Yeah, I'm coming to this one with a lot of nostalgia, because I was one of the little girls who grew up under the spell of Cinderella. She was my Disney princess until she was replaced by The Little Mermaid when I was like 11, when that movie came out. So There's like a lot of love and warm feelings associated with it, especially with the fairy godmother, who looms very large in my memory for a character who has just one scene. And I know that Cinderella has come to represent everything wrong with princess culture and the way that media fails girls, and there are some fair criticisms, but I'm surprised to find myself compelled to defend it.
Okay.
In this essay, I will seek to provide evidence that Cinderella is a feminist text. Just kidding. It's definitely not, but it definitely doesn't deserve its bad rap.
I'm not as much of a fan as you seem to be. I don't dislike it. I have to say 3 stars at least.
Did you watch it as a kid?
Not as a kid, but I definitely saw it. Or maybe it was as a kid. I don't recall. I don't remember specifically seeing it. I remember seeing E.T. when I was young, but I don't remember us watching the Disney movies. My sister was only is only a year older than me. I don't remember her being a big fan.
We weren't big Disney kids either. Not until like the Renaissance.
But also, we weren't really big movie people. I've talked before about how we saw Back to the Future on tape. No, was it on tape? I think it was on tape. Over and over and over. We saw Lethal Weapon, the edited version, on tape 100 times. And Uncommon Valor, weird movies for young people to watch. We were in our very young teens probably when all this happened. And we had Batman a couple years later on tape, and my nephew saw it over and over and over when he'd visit us. And there are others, but I don't remember that many movies being ones that we would watch, that we owned, that we saw. But then when I got into movies, I did like a lot of the Disney stuff and bought quite a few of them on DVD and Blu-ray, but I never bought this one. And I didn't need to, and I'm glad I didn't, because the Disney Plus version of this is phenomenal. And I guess part of the reason why is because it was remastered in 4K, and we got the 4K TV about a year ago. It's one of the best things we've seen on that TV.
One of the things this movie has going for it in spades is it is a work of art.
Colors pop,
animation. It is so beautiful.
This is back when they would have people act out the scenes, and they wouldn't rotoscope over them. I don't think it was quite as simple as that. It's not like Waking Life or some of those Linklater films that he did, where they would just literally draw over, but they'd make it really trippy, and that and A Scanner Darkly. Linklater did that. But they would use it as a reference. And there's one time especially I noticed with the prince. I think it's when he's running after her, when she says, "I gotta leave, it's gonna be midnight." Doesn't tell him why she's leaving, but it's because everything's gonna turn back the way it was. The pumpkin, her dress. The animals will not be the horses and footmen and so on. But when he runs after her, I think is what it is, he looks like a human that's actually animated. But apparently this was a common thing, even with Cinderella, but certainly with the prince. I think that was also true, by the way, in Snow White. I feel like when we saw the prince, he looked phony compared to what the other characters did. Obviously, the dwarves and the animals in that movie wouldn't have looked that fake because they weren't real. Well, the animals could be real, but they were so anthropomorphized.
I think I saw still images from the pictures that they took for reference of Snow White. I'm pretty sure that they rotoscoped it, too, to make the movements look believable. I mean, how else do animators do this stuff? It looks so good.
That's how Disney did it. I don't think it's been like that in the years since. I don't think the company was doing that when they made the modern classics, the ones I like better. That's the thing. You asked me about this movie, and I don't know when I saw it. I never wanted to own it. But I do love, not so much Little Mermaid, it's fine. But I love Beauty and the Beast. Big Lion King fan, saw it twice in the theater back in 94. I like Aladdin quite a lot. And then, of course, Pixar took over, and they became the dominant one. But I own so many of those. We own so many of those.
Do you have,
movies.
like, a favorite classic,
Snow
golden
White.
or silver?
Easily Snow White.
Yeah,
and number 2 is
okay.
easily Pinocchio. And everything else for me drops off big time. Dumbo's fine. This is a little bit more than fine, but it's still not a great movie to me because of some of the flaws in it. And really what it comes down to, I guess, is I wish it was funnier. And it's also a musical, but that does require air quotes. There are not that many songs in this, which I don't have a problem with because I'm not a huge musical fan. But Bibbidi-Bobbidi Boo, yeah, it's a musical sequence, and so is Dream Is Your... What's it called?
A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes You.
And there are a few others, but to call this a musical is a little bit dubious. There's some I do love, and the ones I love I would put in my short list for my favorite movies ever, like Singing in the Rain and Wizard of Oz. I think Hairspray is a brilliant musical. I love that one. And Chicago from 2002. But so is Snow White. It's one of the great musicals of all time. I guess I should include that one too. But I guess it's the mice thing. They're not funny. The prince has no personality. He's barely in the movie at all. And it is a mistake to have it be the footman, or not the footman, the Duke at the end is going around to find Cinderella because he's got a fair amount of screen time. We already said that the king has probably more screen time than anybody other than Cinderella. Lady Tremaine is a great villain, although not one of the greatest villains because they've had so many great ones, like in Snow White, like in Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent. And she's just mean-spirited. We don't really see... Well, you could say she's traumatized or heartbroken that her husband died.
I don't think so.
But it seems like she's just mean-spirited.
They seem to just clearly say she cares about status. She married a wealthy man. Her next step up the ladder in status would be to get one of her daughters to marry a rich man. She's just interested in getting her daughter's attention. And obviously he's a terrible mother, spoils them rotten, they're terrible kids. And Cinderella's just sitting there being beautiful and gentle and lovely.
And not at all affected by what she's gone through all these years by this woman.
If she had just been kind to Cinderella and been a mother to her, then Cinderella could have married well, and she could have stepped up in status that way. Treated her like a daughter and taken advantage of the fact that your stepdaughter.
You know why she wouldn't have? She'd be worried that Cinderella would do what she would do, which is nuts to you. You're not my family, even though she would have been. We've talked about it many times. Your stepmother is your family. She's not a stepmother in name only. She's another mother to you. And we would never ditch her if and when the time comes that your dad is not alive anymore, and she's probably going to outlive him. She's not out of our family when that happens. But in this family, I think Lady Tremaine thinks that. If Cindy gets big, we're done. Mm-hmm. Although she's doing pretty well. Well, then again, they talk about how the castle they have has been going to ruin, I guess because they don't have a lot of money.
Or because they're poorly managing it. She's just irresponsible.
But if you care about status, then you're going to make sure your place looks nice.
That's true. In the French version by Charles Perrault...
Yeah, this effectively is a French story.
Cinderella as a story has been around who knows how long. The earliest version was Greek, and it was written somewhere between 7 BC and like 23 AD were the dates I saw. The Charles Perrault story that this is based on, his version was very popular, French, and he introduced the concept of the glass slipper, the pumpkin that turns into a carriage. I think he may have been the first version with a fairy godmother. A lot of versions don't even necessarily have that.
Okay. It was 1697, by the way.
Now, the Brothers Grimm took another crack at it in the early 19th century.
Which one of them were the ones that had the stepsisters cutting
It was the Brothers Grimm. The Germans, man.
Well, make the point. Cutting their feet off to try to fit into that
cutting
slipper.
Their toes off so that they could fit in the shoes, yeah. Their version is much more bleak and violent, and it is funny. The French romantic version, and it was the Romance period, wasn't it, in the 1700s? Because it was that period between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, versus the Germans, they cut the toes off. Now, I've made the point to say, in the French version that this is based on, the much kinder version, she extends kindness to her stepfamily, and she makes sure that they're looked after. In the Brothers Grimm version, she has them arrested. She takes her vengeance out on them.
Tarantino's version.
Directed by Quentin Tarantino.
He has been reincarnated. He was alive way back then.
You could easily make a real meal out of talking about how this story has evolved over the ages, and certainly how it's been reinterpreted in our generation, even just from the 50s when our moms grew up watching Cinderella, versus the versions of Cinderella that little girls are watching now. Well, you saw the Kenneth Branagh version.
Yeah, I don't remember it all that well. I was surprised to see the critical response. I knew it did very well at the box office, and it was a blockbuster smash. But I don't remember the movie at all, and it was probably still that she's... And maybe that's another problem I have with this, not just the mice and the fact that they take up so much screen time and I don't think they're funny, but that Cinderella is too perfect. You could say that about Snow White, too, but then again, she runs away, so she won't be killed in the opening. The guy, the woodsman? Huntsman, yeah. And I cut out your heart, but you gotta get out of here. I'll fake it to the... What's she called again?
The witch.
It's also a stepmother, isn't it?
Yeah, it's also a stepmother.
The queen, I guess she's just called.
I think
she becomes
she's
the hag.
queen, that's right, yeah.
And then she finds the dwarves, but she is sad for a little while. Cinderella never is. You could say, well, I'm
what
sad.
Are you talking about? She's crying. That's what makes
okay,
the
a few
fairy
seconds
godmother.
then. Yes, for a few seconds. And that's when her mean-spirited stepsisters rip apart the dress that the mice and the birds helped create for Cinderella, because it's just cast-off pieces that they had. They don't care about these things, but that's how mean they are. That's why she cries. And also because she can't go to the ball, not knowing what would happen if she did go to the ball. If she'd gone looking like that, would he have liked her the same way?
Oh, they wouldn't have let her in the door, I don't think. Looking like that and...
No, what the dress that the mice and the birds created for her, if the sisters hadn't ruined it.
Yeah, good question. It was pretty, but it's kind of basic
because
compared
all these
to what all the other girls are
other
wearing.
probably good-looking women are being introduced to the prince, and he doesn't probably even want this anyway. His father's the one who says, I need grandkids. The prince came back from doing something else, and okay, fine, I'll entertain this. And he's probably been standing there for a while with, here's this person, here's this girl, and that one. He's impressed by none of them, but then Cinderella knocks his socks off.
Who's not presented to him because she's not actually there to meet a man.
Right.
People present this as a romance.
He
they always
sees her
talk about
across.
this as a romance. But the
Why
romance is
do
like...
birds?
Yeah. It's love at first sight. For him, she doesn't even notice him. She's not interested in meeting the prince or the man at all.
She doesn't know he's the prince.
She's not even interested in escape. She just wants to have one night where she's free, where she gets to put on a pretty dress, where she likes to go dancing. I want to return to your point, though, that she has no meaningful personality because she has no meaningful...
Just a little bit.
Little bit. I think one of the things that people criticize this movie for fairly is that she sets this impossible standard for girls to reach, and that she's impossibly beautiful. She's got the blonde hair and the big blue eyes, a waist that you could fit your hands around and your fingers would touch. And
kind to everybody and everyone.
Kind to everybody. Patient even with the cat, and the perfect behavior in the face of all this abuse. She doesn't take it on the chin exactly, but she always says and does the right thing and does her best. And it's boring, and it's impossible.
And a terrible message for young people or even older women to see. You gotta just be nice when somebody's mean to you.
This is where I want to push back and say, is it a terrible message? The film, the story in general, is pretty clear that this is a person who's living in a household where she's abused. There's nowhere she can go, nothing she can do. What does she do? Well, she makes the best of it. She makes friends with the household vermin. And,
who can basically talk, especially
who can
Jacques.
Talk, yeah, and wear clothes. She doesn't let it get her down. She doesn't let it change her from being the sweet person that she is. And when you think of how she escapes her situation, it's her kindness and her optimism that save her, because it's her kindness to all the creatures of the house that have them help her escape at the end, help her get the key. They all work together to save Cinderella because they care about her because she earned it. Mm-hmm. And it's her optimism that makes the fairy godmother appear in the first place. When she's crying on the bench, that's it, I have no faith anymore, and there's nothing to hope. And then the fairy godmother says, well, if you'd lost all your faith, I couldn't be here. That is a quote. Oh. I'm here because you believe in me. And like I said earlier, I love the character of the fairy godmother. She's not this ethereal being. She's this clumsy grandmother, this doddering but almost huggable woman.
As I recall, the way they animate Mrs. Potts briefly at the end of Beauty and the Beast, very similar.
Very similar.
Matronly, overweight, but very pleasant and nice.
I didn't even really have grandmothers growing up, but there's something about her that just makes me want to hug her and like bury myself in that woman, and it would just be comforting. She's such a warm character.
And inclusive because, yes, Cinderella needs horses and a footman and a coachman. It's inclusive because they're the animal friends. It's the dog, it's the horse, and it's the mice. Mm-hmm. The mice are the horses.
And everybody gets an upgrade. You can make the horse one of the horses, but it's like, no. He drives the horses. I can't remember maybe he's the footman, or the dog is the footman.
One of the two, yeah.
You know what I mean? They become people, and the mice become horses.
Mm-hmm. Even the pumpkin gets an upgrade.
Even the pumpkin gets probably the biggest upgrade of all.
Okay, so let's do the reasonably good questions right now, because a few of them have been covered already. Why didn't the glass slippers change back like everything else did at midnight? The pumpkin did. All the animals did. Cinderella's dress goes away. But the glass slipper is still in the prince and in the duke's possession, whatever it is, days later when he goes looking for this girl. Oh, by the way, a bit of a sidebar. One of the reasons the mice help out with the key and try to get Cinderella out of the attic, is because it's a royal decree. They know the king has proclaimed this must happen, so they're listening to their king. He wants this girl. I'm going to say guy. Wants this guy. He wants this girl specifically for his son. Anyway, why didn't everything else change back? The two slippers are still the same.
Cinderella only wants one night out at the ball, but her fairy godmother wants her to actually escape, and she leaves the slippers on purpose so that the prince can find her again. There's a point where Cinderella's holding the slipper. It's before she even knows that she was dancing with the prince all night and that he's going to look for her. But she's just holding the slipper.
She just thinks he's a guy.
She just thinks he's a
rich guy.
And she thinks she'll never see him again. And she is just so consumed with gratitude that she got to go to the ball at all, that she's holding the slipper like her little memento of the evening. And she says thank you to the fairy godmother. Okay. That's all she wanted. She thinks it's just something to remember always this night. But I think it's like the fairy godmother's way of making sure that she can escape.
They point out online, too, that Cinderella loses an item of footwear 3 times. Her slipper drops off for a comedy bit when Lucifer is going after the mice. I think it's supposed to be Bruno, the fat mouse.
That's Gus.
Yeah, Bruno's the dog,
Bruno's dog, yeah.
So, yeah, going after Gus. Maybe also as a bit of a theme. Maybe Disney or the animators, because the animators were geniuses for sure. Great artists.
It's just like writing to say, look, she loses shoes all the time. Obviously, the smallest feet in the kingdom.
Well, there's another reasonably good question. Cinderella is the only one in the kingdom with such tiny feet. And if some other girl just happened to have the same size feet as her, the prince has to marry her because that's a decree. Whoever has this size foot is going to be my son's wife.
Is going to be my grandchildren's mother. God help this girl if she has trouble getting pregnant.
Also
that
true.
King will murder her.
Another reasonably good question. What does he do to her?
So I think it's the honest trailers. They were like, sure, good luck. You got out of the clutches of your evil stepmother to go straight to your evil father-in-law who was going to kill his duke. because Cinderella got away. Like, he's literally chasing him, trying to behead him as a punishment for Cinderella getting away because he wants grandchildren so bad.
Before the Duke goes looking for her, yeah. And then not being very careful with that slipper, flipping it around every which way. Somehow it doesn't break until it does break, but she's got the other one.
The most satisfying moment in the movie is not when she takes off with the prince.
Shrek does the exact same ending. They ride off on a coach together.
That's great. It's when the slipper breaks, she pulls out the other slipper, the close-up on Lady Tremaine's face of shock, because she knows she's lost and that's it, it's over. But the satisfaction of knowing she got the best of Lady Tremaine is the true victory. It's not a love story. It's about freedom. Now, another thing you could argue of being a pretty sexist trope, but A, it was 1950, B, it's based on a story from 300 years ago, is that her freedom is immediately being shackled to a total stranger, marrying him, and whatever comes with that. And ask any woman who's married into the British royal family in the last few decades, and they'll probably tell you that she might prefer staying with her evil stepfamily. You don't really know what she's in for, but of course, it's a fairy tale. And it was the 50s. When I say our mothers grew up watching this movie, they also grew up being like, well, I don't even get to leave my parents' house until I'm marrying a man. That really truly was the only way to step forward in your life as a grown woman and to escape your family of origin.
Happened to my mom. She went from her parents' house to live with my dad.
My mom didn't get married till she was 24. Well, she lived with her parents till she was 24, and her parents sucked. So they weren't very nice to her. They sucked. She didn't come from a happy, safe home, and she was just stuck living with them until she got married. That was true even in 1950 when the movie came out. All the princess movies that are made now, they don't go back to this. I think it's fair to say it's safe to let your daughters watch this movie and to treat it like a conversation you can have about, wow, look what things were like back then. When there's so many other great examples of female heroes in children's movies. My favorite female hero in any children's movie, in the sense that it's a movie I would show my daughter if we had kids, is Riley in Inside Out, because she really is just a normal kid. And she's really herself, and her gender doesn't seem to matter at all. That's what makes her my favorite female hero in a kid's movie.
She's a good choice. That was a really good movie last year.
Yeah, it was great.
As for the prince, he's never actually called Prince Charming, even though that's what it says in the credits. Was he especially charming? He seemed okay. They do talk. It's not just that they have a dance
kind.
and then she runs off. They sit and talk for a little while, so she must have got to know him a little bit.
Not enough to tell him her name.
Or vice versa.
Right? Yeah.
He probably doesn't want to be judged for it. Then again, everyone else there knows why they're there. He doesn't know that she doesn't know why she's there. She just thinks it's a ball. And it's actually believable that she wouldn't know who he is because she's probably never been out of that castle.
Yeah, and she's not paying attention.
Her castle.
Yeah. It just was never her goal to go out in the first place.
And Tremaine and the girls didn't tell her why they're going. They're, by the way, this is typical for an animated movie, especially Disney, really throughout their history, but especially back in this era, to make them so unattractive.
Yeah, Lady Tremaine is not exactly beautiful. She's very harsh looking. But what did her first husband look like to produce
She's
these
about a
daughters?
6. They're 3s at best.
Yeah. They're so outrageously ugly. Another thing that people say is unhelpful about this film is that it reinforces that notion that ugly equals bad and pretty equals good.
Which was almost always the case back then. But during the dance, I found it interesting. More reasonably good questions, I guess. No one leaves in disgust. None of the other guys brought their daughter, before the glass slipper stuff, before the decree at the very end. They went to that ball to marry him because this is what the king wants. Mm-hmm. And then they all just stand around and watch, which you could say, well, they have to, or else the king would, you're in trouble, man. But none of them leave in disgust. And also, the Tremaines, all 3 of them, they don't recognize somebody that they've been around forever and ever.
Well, Lady Tremaine puts it together later.
She looks slightly different because her hair's not the same and everything. And why would she be here? She's wearing this dress, which, by the way, is white in this movie. I think it's blue in other versions. And when you see girls at Halloween wearing Cinderella dresses, aren't they always blue? Or am I thinking of some other character?
Frozen. You think of Elsa.
Maybe it's Elsa.
She's just so overwhelmingly popular.
But I think there's something about how it's not always white in every version of this movie. And there have been many versions of this in the sense of fixing it up, remastering it.
There was another version that came out in the same year. There's a Spanish version called Once Upon a Time. It's like a budget version, and they probably didn't want to compete directly with Disney's version.
I think I read that it's silver, but to me it looks white. Don't you agree?
Yeah, it's white. It looks like it's covered in crystals or something because it sparkles.
And it's almost like a wedding dress, if it's going to be white anyway.
She doesn't care if she's a bride, but the audience does.
Right. But I mentioned that Lady Tremaine especially, and the sisters, don't recognize her. And this is my last reasonably good question. Why doesn't the prince just go with the Duke? Because he would recognize Cinderella. The slipper would be helpful still, but he would literally know who she is. Except he only saw her one time. It's maybe been days. But here's the thing that I think actually in some ways does track with why the people she's known, these 3 women, forever and ever, wouldn't recognize her. You could argue they never look at her face. They have such disdain that they really don't know what she looks like, which is a little bit spurious, but still, if you don't look at somebody's face and then they're in a place they're not supposed to be, dressed differently, you maybe somewhat reasonably could say they don't know who she is.
We've all had moments where we see somebody out of context. I had a job once where we all wore uniforms, and I only saw this person in uniform, but I saw them all the time. All summer I spent working with them, and then I ran into them at a casino, and I couldn't remember their name. I spent all summer hanging out with them, working with them, and then it just suddenly blanked. Who is this person? One of my most embarrassing moments, to be honest. Because it was insane that I could not remember her name. It's Michelle. I'll remember till the day I die.
Now you will. I'm also always the one that admits that I don't recognize people when they wear sunglasses and a baseball hat. Mm-hmm. That's what celebrities supposedly do to blend in. They would certainly fool me.
Yeah, exactly.
My friends could. People I see all the time.
But I guess they just don't recognize her. Maybe it's the enchantment as well.
That is creative, by the way, having a pumpkin turn into a coach and having the animals, the mice at least, turning into the horses, and then the other 2 guys become human. And, of course, her entire outfit changes so much. It's a pretty great sequence. I don't love Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo as a song. It's fine. It's good.
Blasphemy.
It's in the
really?
top 50 Disney songs, I guess.
Oh, my God. I am allergic to nostalgia, and it doesn't really affect me the way it seems to affect other people. But when I heard the opening of Bibbidi-Bobbidi Boo, I had like shivers. And it was just like a pure pleasure experience of going home to childhood, And I was like, oh, this is why people like nostalgia.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the voice cast. Nobody in here is all that famous unless you're some super Disney fan. You're going to say, but they are to me. Well, not to me, and I'm a pretty big Disney fan. So Eileen Woods is the voice of Cinderella. She had small roles in just a few other movies. I didn't see anything else that really stood out all that much. Eleanor Audley is the voice of Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty, and she worked a lot until 1970. I didn't write down. I'm pretty sure she is the stepmother, Lady Tremaine. She is, yeah, Eleanor Audley. So she's 2 of the great villains of the 50s anyway in Disney movies. Verna Felton, who is the fairy godmother, was also a voice in Alice in Wonderland, Lady and the Tramp, and Sleeping Beauty. I'm not a huge fan of some of those movies, but that's a pretty great run. And I'm forgetting Peter Pan was in the 50s too. I like the modern era better, but that is a good decade.
I did like a little dive into the eras of Disney because I was curious when I read about how this really saved the studios. They lost a lot of their animators and staff during the war, and just like everybody else.
And the movies didn't do very well either.
They had to cut corners.
Even Pinocchio, Bambi, and Fantasia, and I think even Dumbo, were not that big a hit at the time. It was because of re-releases. Yeah,
they were considered part of the golden age pre-war.
Yeah,
right?
Early 40s is also an incredible era for them, for sure.
Yeah, mid to late war to 1950, they were really struggling.
Song of the South succeeded. The one that no one's ever going to see again, probably.
We'll never see. Imagine fully burying a movie that much. That's the power of Disney. But when they were financing Cinderella, it was a very ambitious project. It was very expensive. It took years. And they were basically betting the farm on this. And if it had failed, then it would have been the end of the studio. Not only did it not fail, but it succeeded so much. It was such a hit that it allowed them to launch their own distribution company, which only lasted 3 years. But they also started Disneyland. That was when they started.
The Florida Project.
Yes. No, that's Disney World.
Oh, okay, right.
Disneyland was first.
Oh, right. Disneyland, of course, is in
50s,
California.
Yeah.
Disney World is the one in Orlando, right?
Cinderella was considered the first film of the silver age of Disney animation. It had a different look, more romantic, probably modern at the time, and includes Cinderella, Snow White, 101 Dalmatians, Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, until Walt Disney himself passed away. I think it was in the mid to late 60s.
Yeah, and they were also making the live action movies by then, too.
Right.
I think Swiss Family Robinson may have been one of them, and that was a monster hit. I think it was them. I could be wrong with that. Come back to the voice cast. Either Luis or Louis, I don't know, Van Rooten is the voice of both the King and the Grand Duke. He was also, I guess, on screen in Champion and Detective Stories, one of the few people that was in any live-action movies that really stood out to me. Champion is the Kirk Douglas boxing movie. Detective Stories is a Kirk Douglas detective movie. William Phipps is the voice of the prince as the speaker, somebody's just talking, and he was in War of the Worlds a couple years later, the 1950s version, obviously. And Mike Douglas, yes, that Mike Douglas, the talk show host, was the singing version of the prince, which isn't often. I guess he sings once. I don't even know. I don't remember exactly.
So this is love.
Okay, so that's Mike Douglas, who became a talk show host. And then James McDonald, who worked for Disney for a long time, there's so many credits for this guy on there, including Snow White and Fantasia, was the voice of both Jacques and Gus. Now, there you go. We talked about how they weren't really sparing expenses, but then Van Rooten and McDonald both did voice of two major characters. Four of the most major characters have as much dialogue, probably, the mice, it's weirder dialogue, but it is still dialogue, as Cinderella, and yet it's two guys doing the voice of four of them.
It's pretty common in animation, for good reason.
Maybe not so much when it's the major characters.
Well,
But they're
yeah,
fine.
sure.
But I wouldn't have known that, though. I only know that because I look it up online. If I was just watching this movie and didn't know that, I wouldn't recognize Van Rooten and McDonald doing multiple things. And the last name I'll mention for the cast, the voice people, Betty Lou Gerson is the narrator, so she only, I think, appears or is heard at the very beginning. And she was Cruella, the voice of Cruella, in 101 Dalmatians.
One of the great villains. Did Cruella make the list of heroes and villains?
I think so. I'll take a look.
I would make my case for Lady Tremaine belonging on the list. There's so many great Disney villains.
She didn't make the list.
She was nominated.
Cruella is 39th on the villain side of the heroes and villains list.
I discovered in my research that a lot of people who are survivors of abuse really do relate to this movie. And I can see Lady Tremaine fitting into that because she's such an insidious villain. She's obviously evil. The film broadcasts it with every frame. The lighting choice, the music cue, she's terrifying. But the way she tortures Cinderella always includes just enough plausible deniability that she can't be called out on it.
She's doing chores.
She's doing chores. If Cinderella were to complain about her situation, she just sets it up and gaslights her and emotionally abuses her along with the situation that she's put her in. And there's something about her methods of manipulation that ring almost too true. Even as an adult, I find her so deeply upsetting in those scenes where she's just calmly instructing Cinderella why she can't go to the ball or what she has to do in order to earn going to the ball. And of course, that scene where they tear her dress apart, it's an assault and it's terrifying. And she's kind of enjoying it, but then she just gets to pretend that what's she supposed to do? Maybe you shouldn't have taken my girl's things.
And sisters fight sometimes.
Sisters fight sometimes, yeah. It was interesting to read reviews written by survivors about how this movie really spoke to them when they were growing up and really made them feel less alone and how much they appreciate that Cinderella doesn't run away. She doesn't
or want revenge.
Fight it. She doesn't want revenge. She is just simply trying to cope and survive because she has no meaningful options. So there's no survivor blaming. The implication might be that, well, if it was so bad, then you should fight and you should escape and you should do this and that. But that's just blaming survivor for their own abuse.
Yeah.
And that for her to escape, she needed help from the outside, which is true about a lot of children.
Supernatural help.
Supernatural help, but also help, like I said, from her mouse and bird and dog friends.
And she's fairly deserving, even though she doesn't know this guy at all. Clyde Geronimi, I don't know how you say that name, was one of the directors. There's three. Wilfred Jackson was one as well, and Hamilton, I guess it's Lusk, Luske. Clyde worked for Disney in the 50s a lot. I didn't write down all the credits, but I think he was often involved with them that era anyway. Wilfred Jackson was involved in Snow White and many other Disney flicks. And then Luske, Hamilton, was involved in Alice in Wonderland and 101 Dalmatians, so some big titles for him. There are 8 writers on this that are credited with the story, plus 2 uncredited writers. So they are Bill Peet, Erdman Penner, Ted Sears, Winston Hibler, Homer Brightman, Harry Reeves, Ken Anderson, and Joe Rinaldi. The 2 uncredited people are Maurice Raff and Frank Tashlin. That name I recognize. Maybe a Disney person. I didn't write that down. They based it on Charles Perrault's 1697 fairy tale. He's also known for classics like Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, Bluebeard, and Sleeping Beauty. If he did 3 of those, that'd be impressive. And he did, 5 different ones?
Well, he didn't write them exactly. It's not like he invented these stories. These stories all existed.
Well, maybe he invented some of them.
It was his version of an existing folklore.
Okay. And of course, Walt Disney was the producer, as he always was. He was uncredited. I don't think he was ever actually Walt Disney producer on the screen in the credits, but he was the producer and the driving force. Although maybe not as much on this. I think I heard or read he was trying to get some of the live action movies going, and I'm sure, didn't we say this already, Disneyland, Disney World. So he wasn't maybe as involved as he had been, yet it still came off so well. Maybe sometimes it's good to have the boss not be around. Ben Sharpstein was a supervising producer on this too, and he directed he gets directing credit on Snow White, which I think is the greatest animated movie of all time. The film is 137-1. We saw it, of course, on Disney+. Outstanding transfer. The editor, Donald Halliday, cut Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, and 101 Dalmatians. And the music score, which was nominated for the Oscar, Paul Smith and Oliver Wallace shared that. Smith worked on Snow White and Pinocchio, and Oliver Wallace worked on Dumbo and many others. Now, we didn't talk about the music and the editing that much. The movie's really short. But then again, there's not a lot of there when it comes to humans. It's about the mice, and that's a weakness. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, the sound editing, we were talking about this.
Because The Wild Robot is nominated this year for the Oscar. It's one of the rare times that an animated movie has been up for its sound. Maybe there's 10 examples, but that's not that many, considering the entire thing has to be made from scratch.
Yeah, it's like an undervalued art. One of our favorite movies of the year, Flow, has just one of the most beautiful soundscapes.
That should be up for almost every Oscar.
It is. Oh my God, stop what you're doing right now and see Flow. If you have to pay for it, pay for it. It is worth it. Yeah.
What happens next? They lived somewhat happily ever after. Who can say if they really did? After all, they barely know each other, and they're basing their quote-unquote love on their looks and talking for maybe an hour, possibly a few hours. This marriage may not last very long. And as you said before, the king may be a tyrant in an even worse way than the stepmother was.
They just better be babies, and they better come soon.
And they better be good looking. Well, they're going to be good looking.
Yeah.
That'd be impossible not to be. Okay, then last thoughts on the classic Cinderella.
I say, let your daughters watch Cinderella again. You can follow it up with a conversation about how it's bad to marry someone you've only spent one evening with, even if they are a prince.
And don't let your rodents make your clothes, although they're talented rodents, talented birds.
They're very talented rodents. I don't know why they're all wearing clothes of their own.
You know what Lady Tremaine should be doing? I guess she doesn't know this is happening, but she should take advantage of these magical mice and magical birds and market that, fix up the place, and then she'd be happy again.
Yeah, you don't even need your daughters.
You don't need one of them, including your stepdaughter you don't even like, to marry big, marry rich.
Yeah.
Well, I like the movie fine. It's nowhere near one of my favorites in the Disney catalog, because Cindy herself is a little dull.
She's a cipher. We never mentioned this.
Okay, yeah.
She is meant for any little girl to put their own personality, project, just like the Neo thing,
Except she is so perfect. And most ciphers aren't this perfect.
Fair enough.
But anyway, she's a little dull. I like in one of the, maybe the Shrek movies. I think it might be a Shrek movie, but one of those. Maybe it's Tangled. I forget. Where they've got the Disney princesses teaming up, and they call her Cindy, because why wouldn't they? And of course, if people don't know, it's actually an insult to call her Cinderella, because the cinder part, her name would be Ella, but the cinder part refers to, what is it, a fireplace?
It's that she sleeps by the fireplace. So when she wakes up, she's covered in ash.
Yeah, so she's like white,
cinders.
dirty white trash, really, to call her Cinderella, even though it's such a pretty name that we all associate with this great
It's like calling you Dirty Ryan, yeah.
Well, I did have a shower an hour ago. I'm very clean. So there's way too much of the mice and the cat, Lucifer. It's not that funny. Not like the dwarves in Snow White. The prince is an afterthought at best. It really could have stood another 10 minutes of character development. It's so short. I think it's an hour 18 on Disney Plus, but so much of that is the who voiced this character in Portugal, who voiced this character in Jamaica. They do that so much at Disney Plus, where the actual running time is probably 5 or even 6 minutes shorter than the movie is. So it's, what does it say how long it actually is again? IMDb would tell me. Hang on a second. The actual runtime of the movie should be an hour 14. Okay, so it's pretty short. It could have been at least an hour 20, hour 22, and give the prince a little bit more to do.
Disney is somehow, with a time machine, I heard your notes. I feel that in the modern Disney movies, they do fill that time with character development. In the early Disney films, they're just like, here's a bunch of silliness, and we're doing that kind of thing in a film to just fill time. Whereas now they would give you a little more backstory. You probably would learn a lot more about Lady Tremaine, and there would be a lot more back and forth with her and the sisters. And you would give the prince a personality and a motive, a name. And that's how you would fill out the story rather than the old-fashioned way of doing it. Snow White is very guilty of this, too. We talked about this when we covered that movie. Yeah. Long interludes of the dwarves just being silly.
But they're funny.
It's just better.
But the prince
they're better characters.
The white guy is the afterthought. Ironically enough.
You mean the prince in Snow White?
That movie and this one. It's the white guy who doesn't really matter so much, unlike, say, a white girl's in the background. A movie that's all about guys. And
it ought to be.
So, by the way, the remake, the brand new live-action version, an hour 45. So about a half hour more of content in that. Anyway, that was how we saw Cinderella. And that's the last romantic movie in Old Love Month that Bev and I will do together, although I'll be back for a solo show on Friday. And I'll be yipping about Lana Turner and John Garfield in The Postman Always Rings Twice. The reason I say that the romance movies are done, even though the podcast isn't done for you and I this month, is that we still have another podcast to do together next Monday. And it's the Oscars preview show we always do every year, because the 2024, last year's Oscar, I always hate this. It's 2025, but we've got to call it the 2024 Oscars, which is what I always call it, the year that the movies were nominated or won the awards. So the Oscars are on March 2nd, and we have a preview show on February the 24th. The 10th annual Oscars preview show. And I always ask this question, or at least have for many years. We've done this for 10 years. I probably asked this question at least 4 or 5 times. The coming attractions opinion question I always ask is, what do you want to see win Best Picture?
All right, so for our answers to that question, check out next week's Oscar preview episode. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to favorite or subscribe. There are hundreds of episodes that are available for you to check out. How many, Ryan?
645.
If you like us and you'd like to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is by leaving us a rating and a review. Another way to support us and to support a great small Canadian business that we genuinely use and love is by going to sparkplug.coffee/HYES, where you can get freshly roasted premium coffee delivered straight to you, and that HYES will get you started with a 20% discount. You can also find us on YouTube. Our channel is at HYES Ellis, and we would love to hear from you. There are a few ways to find us, starting with Twitter. I am at Bev Ellis, and Ryan is at MovieFiend51, but you can probably more reliably find me these days on Blue Sky. I am Bev Ellis there as well. Ryan is Ryan-Ellis on Blue Sky, and our email address is haveyouvseenseenpodcast@gmail.com.
Let's go live somewhat happily ever after. Let's be reasonable about this. This is no fairy tale.
Let's live contentedly ever after.
Good enough.
Much more pragmatic end to a fairy tale. How about that?
I will live with that.
And cut.